Hello, Jen. How you doing?
Hello. I'm okay. How are you doing?
It's fine, thanks. What have you been working on?
Um, so I'm still, because I've been folding my research into all my projects, I'm still working on that. Right now, I'm hoping to think about how I can use this work to apply to the PhD program over the Christmas break. So I have the criteria of what they're looking for. They're basically looking for, they call it a statement of academic intent, but it would be the research proposal and then a 15 to 20 page writing sample. So I need to figure out like which of my essays I would submit as a writing sample, and maybe I could brainstorm like what I want to be showing in this writing, before I totally finish it, to make a good impression.
So you have already completed the writing sample, or are you working on the writing sample right now?
I'm working on writing for my project, so it's gonna just have to be the writing sample because I didn't do English last year, so my other essays would be like too old, and it, theoretically should be better because I've been doing more research, so it will be what I'm writing now for my classes. I will have to submit one of those two papers, and then a research proposal, which I'm also submitting for a class.
Okay. So in the time that we have today, we're going to be looking at something that you're working on currently?
Well, I was just wondering if we could think about just what needs to be submitted and why and how. Like, I don't know. It seems kind of vague, but like troubleshooting like what a successful like application would look like, what the writing sample would look like a little bit, and then what the proposal would look like.
Okay. With the proposal, did they outline some criteria that they want you to address? So did they give you any details whatsoever, even a word count or anything that would be kind of helpful?
Yeah, let me share my screen. Okay, can you see that?
It's just loading, so yeah, I can see it's too small a portion for me to read, but
let me just make it bigger then. Is that better? Or bigger still?
Unfortunately, it's still a little hard. I can see the headings, but unfortunately the details are a little bit too small still.
Oh, is it not zooming in as I zoom in? Like, is it not getting bigger for you right now?
I think for one thing, the window's a bit small, so I wonder if maybe that's part of the problem. Let me see. Okay, there we go. That's better.
Is it legible?
We have the transcript. Oh, sorry, Jen, what was that?
Yeah. So this is the PhD for the English application. So references, I have people, transcripts, yeah. So this is the research proposal. And I've clarified with the grad chair that, like, it is a research proposal, though, of course, they would never call it what it is, so it's called a statement of academic intent.
Okay. So, please prepare your first announcement files, purpose to demonstrate the mission quality. So, the quality of your critical thinking, scope of your research agenda, and the ability to state concisely the field of literary cultural situation period. The statement will also allow the committee to determine what the program experience and where changes to the student's outline, graphical information, so the intellectual argument. So I would say start with that. It says focus instead on the intellectual argument. Start with identifying what the intellectual argument is. So if you had to think about what your research is, and if I said, okay, give me the elevator pitch, or like, what's the point? What's the argument? What is the argument of your research?
And right now it's looking at like loss of bodily integrity in the decadent period in romance novels, and it's theorizing basically between gothicity and like modern realism. So I'm kind of trying to theorize on both sides of it because it's kind of at the split right between the gothic and the modern.
Gothic and modern. Okay. So would we say that if we had said so my research focuses on the loss of bodily integrity in the decadent period. In these particular other words, or just say my research focuses on the loss of bodily integrity in the decadent period. That's sort of like an opening line, just to kind of help orient the readers to here's where we're focusing on.
Sorry, what was the question? Yeah, no, I should have a better like I'm
as a
basically
way to start. So we're going to start with, if the focus is on the intellectual argument, my take is, okay, well, let's start by identifying what the intellectual argument is. So the first sentence is, my research focuses on the loss of bodily integrity in the decadent period.
Yeah, and I'm basically looking at like how this intersects with gender, and I'm using. So I guess the basic the mechanism I'm trying to convey a little bit. So this would maybe be more of a thesis statement. Let's see if I could string it together. So it would go something like, okay, this I'll just sketch it really roughly because so the loss of bodily integrity is due to like gender related issues that are basically like bodily integrity, like people's subjectivity in a bodily and an ideological sense is like dissolved in such a way that they reconstitute themselves with a new type of orientation toward the world, which is more gender non-normative. And these novels like show kind of like the technology of how that's being done, either that they're doing that to themselves or other people are doing that to them, and that can be a good expressive thing or it can be an abusive thing. But so it's showing, I'm using skin theory to show the intersection between like the body and ideology, how they're like mutually constructed through the conduit of the skin. So basically, so I'm trying to use trans theory, feminism, I've got some queer theory, we got masculinity studies. So those are the things I'm using to analyze that.
Okay, so my take on it is start small. So you don't have to start at where you are in terms of like the big statement. You can build up to the big statement. Give your reader a bunch of little puzzle pieces, little pieces at a time, until eventually you get like this entire picture made up of showing the whole thing. So that was my take on it, is don't start with saying what your thesis is or the argument, to start with just building context.
Okay.
So very broadly, the topic is the loss of bodily integrity in the decadent period. That's maybe enough for one sentence. I know there's more, but you're not going to cram it all into one sentence.
Okay.
So start there. And then which piece do we want to build in first? The part with how you're looking at how it intersects with gender. So,
I think gender is the most important part.
Yeah. So first idea or bullet point or sentence, loss of bodily integrity in the decadent period. Next is how this idea or how this topic will intersect with gender. Which could lead to either, one thing we could do, we either stop and ask a question like, oh, why are you interested with how it interacts with gender, or just ignore the question and just go on with now the next part, which is start to then kind of work towards your argument, which is you are arguing that in this process, I think I wrote down really quickly some words you used, subjectivity is dissolved. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So that is kind of what you find in your research, is that in this process, or if we like look at this topic within the context of how it intersects with gender, what we find is that subjectivity is dissolved and it starts to like break down.
Yeah, and that was also, anyway, it's kind of confusing, but I'm also piecing out that was like kind of like the state of subjectivity in this specific time period as well. So there's also that element where that's like a timely thing as well. But yes, it's also a specific gendered thing in these novels, yeah, as well.
Oh, interesting. So it interconnects with both the period, like the genre, decadence, is that correct?
Yeah.
And with gender.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's, again, like maybe just like little puzzle pieces, little bit of time. Don't try to do it all in one big sentence. Just give your reader like little bites. Does that make sense? Okay. And then you did say something about how these novels show, you said technology, and I was going to ask you about that. Is it technology or is it like means by which
Yeah,
That's
that's
something
one
to
of
be
those
broken
like
down.
Englishy things where we say technology, it is not technology. I mean, one would also say like erotics of something, which neither makes any sense really. But yes, technology in like a very loose sense, where there's some sort of
Yeah.
like process going on, but it's not. I mean, one of it is this guy being whipped over and over again, so you could argue that is some sort of technology of transness, like. But yeah, not in the conventional sense of like machinery or science
Yes.
necessarily.
I know there are different ways. So some is abusive, some is, like you said, it can be sometimes it's abusive, sometimes it's positive.
Yeah. It,
Interesting.
but because I'm basically in like penetration and like cutting of like skin, so some of that is like rape, some of that is like consensual sex, some of that is whipping. So yeah, it really can depend.
Yes. Okay. So maybe I'd say kind of little piece by piece, kind of break down what you showed with me, but make sure you do it only sentence by sentence.
Okay.
And then where I think maybe spending the bulk of the time is getting into methodology. Like, how do you think you're going to be doing this? Well, one, you said that you're going to be drawing a lot of different theories.
Yeah. Yeah,
Is
I'm
that correct?
predominantly looking. It's a little rough because I'm predominant, and we've talked about this. I know I'm kind of like haunting you this year, like we've talked about all this a lot, but so it's hard because like they couldn't be in a sense conventionally trans characters. I finally wrote this great defense about that's a ridiculous standard to hold them to modern conceptions of transness. So basically I'm like using trans theory but also like falling back on like feminist theory and masculinity theory, which I love, and it's very consistent with like trans theory. So because I think that's an important move to do because you cannot totally argue that they just have to be 2024 trans because that, of course, is a name, right? So, by falling back on strong like feminist and masculinity theory, I think it helps a lot. So I kind of have to throw the kitchen sink at it in that sense.
Yeah, I think that that's what you should detail. I think that you should kind of break down what you're doing and, in a sense, why. Because someone reading this would go, okay, do you have a good sense of, the scope of your research and how, not just what you're going to do, but how you're going to do it.
Okay. And for English, like I mean, I've been doing psychology last year, and I know like a method is like different than like I'm like for English, it's like I'm gonna read a bunch, right? But like, so you just have to outline like what topics you're gonna research, like, and I found basically like my favorite theory to work through this stuff, like I was trying to mention that the huge sentence was like skin theory. So looking at skin as like the kind of the conduit between the inside and outside of the body, and how like the ideology and body and even skin, I think, are all like constituted by each other. So that's a
Absolutely.
nice theory, right? And it's not trans or not, so it's really pretty for me because it has it's technically feminist, but it has the sense of this like neutrality, which I really like. Again, it kind of lets me fall back on something else, right? Other than just like a hot debate about whether they're trans characters, which is not helpful to me, right?
No, I think that's exactly it. I know when we use the word methodology in English, sometimes even I get a little bit kind of like, what? Why are we doing this? Because it all just comes down to, I suppose, close reading. Like, we don't, in terms of like how you're doing it by reading a lot and doing like an analysis. But I think it comes down to like what theories are you using. So a
Yeah,
combination
yeah,
of theories, what lenses. Sometimes we use the word lens, not just theory, but like a certain lens you're applying to it.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely,
yeah, does that
yes.
make sense?
And like with and I do have specificities with that. Like with masculinity studies, I'm looking at um bro, they're really excited about this thing called like anal penetrability. Like, listen, like my studies go to a weird place, but like basically they really decided that is the way they really need to phrase the idea that like men need to be like permeable to like external or other forces as opposed to like trying to be invulnerable. So there's this
Yes.
whole field of that. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's something specific as well. Oh, and I was basically going to try to divide anyway. Who knows if this will work, but I have specific theorists for like I have people who are theorizing like the body and matter, and then I have theorists who are theorizing like skin theory, and then I have theorists who are theorizing kind of like the biopolitical ideological disciplining of the body. So like ideology, like Foucault type vibe, and like some
Very
trans
good.
theory. So
That's
I was
the
thinking,
kind of names I would say. Bring that in. Bring.
yeah, people just like people. I like him too. Everyone just likes Foucault.
I think so. I think if you say Foucault, everyone's like, all right, that's good.
So really do that? Okay, I'm totally down. Like I did a presentation on him this semester. I think he's great. So
Yeah, yeah, no. You have, it says 300 words, so I think you'll have enough space for this. At some point, you probably will run out, or at a certain point, you don't necessarily need to get into like listing like 50 theories. But
yeah,
maybe what I'd say is, your research is quite interesting because, as you said, some things don't quite cover it, or like it's good to fall back on this. I think you have to spend some time stating like it's not. I just can't use trans theory. Trans theory. My impression, I know from other conversations we have, is that like right now trans theory is to like 2024. Is that my kind of, if I were to kind of break that down, it's like it's too much focus on what's happening right now, and you're applying this to the decadent, so it doesn't quite work, right?
well, my biggest problem with it too is like there's the myth of, not the myth, but there's the idea of the wrong body, like as a narrative, right? That like we need to switch bodies because we're in the wrong body. But a lot of trans theorists, most of the trans theorists I have read, say this is an oversimplification of people trying to match the diagnostic criteria of the DSM-5 about gender dysphoria in order to get hormones to transition. So this is a very specific standard that we hold trans people to, which shapes narratives that trans people are writing. But like, there was no gender reassignment at that time.
Therapy and
yes, and there was no diagnostic criteria. So like, how the fuck would they possibly meet that? Right? They would like they wouldn't. And even the idea of feeling like they're in the wrong body is not necessarily constitutive at all of being trans. Which I don't think people really know that, but I really been reading the trans theory, and they really tell me that, and I believe them. So in that case, they're as trans as anybody else, but like it's just not, the standard just doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense. You can't apply it backwards like that.
I think if you want to use like the full 500 words, I think you could take the time to kind of explain a little bit about why you're not just saying here's the theory I'm going to use, but a little about kind of mapping out a little bit. I'm going to say just a little bit for the reader why you are using these particular theories and why it doesn't quite work to just use the current trans theory. It's like you have to do it this way.
Okay,
so,
and my strongest point about that too, if you don't mind if I run it by you for a sec, my strongest point is that like trans theory, much like queer theory, has been elided in the past by assuming like cisnormativity or assuming heteronormativity. So I think that like the work needs to be done about keeping an open mind when we're analyzing gender in the past, and keeping an open mind that there could be trans subjectivities, as opposed to assuming cisnormativity, because that has been assumed for too long in these narratives that can be trans and sometimes are trans. So I want to open up a space where we can just like look at what is actually happening in these narratives without just trying to label it so much, but just understanding how the gender, the development of gender is like non-normative, and it's there's something in it worth learning about. Like that's kind of what I want to say.
I like that. I like how that sort of, I think if you want to kind of towards the end of your statement, get into that kind of big picture. Because I think your research is kind of focused specifically on the decadent, but then it could be expanded to like this idea about non-normative.
Mm-hmm.
Within the broader context of, say, literature and gender studies.
Mm-hmm. But that needs to leave space for transness in trans theory, and it hasn't yet. And so I will use gender theory that is more conventional, but also trans theory, because I feel like that's giving the literature a fair shake, because there were trans people, like, and it matters the tools we can use. We can only see based on the tools we use. Like if we don't use the trans tools, we're not going to see transness, and that's not having academic integrity in a sense, And
do you think that that's how your research would contribute to the broader field?
Yeah, definitely. Especially because it's so nicely consistent with feminist and masculinity studies. Like it lines up just very nicely.
Yeah. Then I think focus, like I said, kind of give it a little piece by piece, focus, get to your argument, then explain how you're going to do that, end with the big picture statement of like how it more broadly contributes to like the field as a large field, as opposed to then just your specific argument. So I see it as kind of progression in stages. You start with just familiarizing with context, get to the argument, get to the methodology, or the theory and the lens in which you're applying, and then end with a sort of, and here's how I envision making, how this will contribute to like the greater vision.
Now, I was wondering about where to put the defense of it, because it is almost like reflected my language from the outset. Not if I just talk about them as gender non-normative, but the moment I label them as trans and then without explaining it, if I like just call them trans characters, then I have a real problem, right? So because then I need buy-in at the beginning but I don't think I'm gonna call them trans characters, because again, I've just argued that like they don't need to be, nor could they be in a sense, even if they were, right? So
that might be something that's too complex to explain in this. It might be something that in your research you'd have to say, here's how we need to like use these terms, or what terms we need to avoid, and here's why.
Okay, so just start with something more clean and more like just academic sounding, and then later on in the proposal, like you were saying, then explain a little bit more how in fact this is a good thing. And I mean, it is, because honestly, like there are actually like transition narratives or like wrong body narratives in this time period that I could use, but I actually think that these narratives are more interesting, because if it's just a wrong body, you just swap genders, right? But these are like transgressive in ways where you don't just swap genders and become cis-normative again. So I think they're more interesting to study, right? Like they're more theoretically like interesting.
And you have particular novels or particular narratives where you see that happening?
Yeah, like the three that I'm using, like they're ambiguous enough to be interesting, and they're also like pretty complicated, I think, about like what is going on. And it's not just a wrong body narrative.
Yeah, I mean, what you could do is, without getting too much into it, just kind of skim the surface, and like you can list the narratives and say these go beyond simply wrong body narratives to embracing this point, and this is why it's worth looking into, because it adds a new dimension to the narrative of you have the wrong body, with a greater scope of challenging the normative.
Yeah, because in these narratives they're basically trying to like reconstitute themselves using kind of like the film or the screen or the skin of the body to change their ideologies and their body kind of in an indirect way. So it's a weird thing, right? So in a sense there's transition happening, but it's like it's the Deleuzian. So I haven't read Deleuze, but what I keep gathering is it's like this Deleuzian notion of like you can't choose an endpoint with change. You can only have like an attitude or like a position toward change, which I think is also like phenomenological, your positioning toward things. So like they're positioning themselves toward a gender non-normativity in order to reach their desires. So it's not even necessarily like transness and gender non-normativity are kind of like an outcropping of them like navigating the world to achieve their desires, which again I think is pretty consistent with the trans texts that I've read. And I have like the trans theorists that I've read that talk about like desire being the motivating factor. It's not about gender transition so much as like desires for a way of like interacting with the world. So they're doing that, but in a like kind of like non-conventional sense, where it's not like just I'm gonna put on pants instead of a skirt and then like I've done it, right? Like it's like they're working through something like also like mentally in a very interesting way.
Yes. Yeah. Good. How do you think about covering that? Do you feel like that's reasonable to cover in maybe as few as 300 or as most at 500 if you have to go?
Now I know something like this has a lot of formal components as well. Like in the end, you're supposed to talk. Because I have to do this assignment, and I went to the writing center gave a talk on how to do proposals last week, and I went to it, and there just seems like there's a million little things you have to do in it. So, I mean, I guess I just have to try to squash it all in.
Now, in that talk, just be aware that sometimes we have to kind of make it broad enough to cover a range of disciplines.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is, did you get more of a sense like that maybe it would have been a talk more applicable for, say, science or social science? Did you see evidence that it would be applying to arts? Only because, for example, with this study, oftentimes we don't need research participants, we don't need lab equipment, we don't need this, we don't need a lot of things. But were there parts in it that seemed extra that maybe don't seem like they're being addressed in the description of what you need to do? So what were some of the things that you said, like, oh, I have to squash this all in? What were some of the things that came to mind?
Okay, well,
sometimes you include, like, literature review, but I don't think this is not the place in 300, 500 words.
Well, for my research methods class run by the grad chair of the English grad studies, she wants a full lit review in this thing, actually.
Yeah. But this is something different.
She wants it for this because it's supposed to be, again, like, it's so funny that they just will never label it anything normal, but apparently it's a research proposal. And she said I should do the research proposal for my master's that I'm developing in her class, which has to have a full lit review, which has to have, like, your research question, which has to have, like, your goal, which has to have, like, your method. Like, it has to have everything.
Okay. Then if that's the case, I'd say, can we take those 500 words and can we chunk them? Can we go, okay, we need 100, let me look at my notes here. Do we, in 100 words, could we give, like, the topic, the question, and your goal? And by goal, I mean your intellectual argument. So what we kind of determine is, first off, let's start with just saying, here's my topic, here's what we're looking at, and my argument is this, or my goal or my research question is, how is subjectivity dissolved in the, let me have a look here.
Yeah, but I know what you mean.
Okay. Do you see I'm getting with that?
And now if I'm confused about, like, when the question collapses into the argument, like, do they need to be different things? Like, because if I'm arguing, I know the argument, like, it's like the answer, but then the question is also still important. So
I often sometimes see there's sort of a redundancy there, but I guess it's kind of helpful in the sense it's a formula, right? If someone else is looking at this argument, okay, but what is the question? And then your argument is basically the same thing, the question, but just phrased as an argument instead. So the research question, although sometimes you might see that kind of like there might be some difference. So the question is, how is subjectivity dissolved through, like, the loss of bodily integrity in these novels? So how is subjectivity dissolved? The argument could be actually, in a sense, more specific, because then you could say specifically how is it dissolved. So now the question is how, and in terms of, like, describe the various processes. The argument could be picking one of those particular processes or making a claim about that particular process. So maybe one of the your argument is that the means, because you mentioned about the anal penetration, right? Is that one means by which subjectivity is dissolved in these stories?
Yeah, and, like, skin related, like, cutting and like penetration. Yes.
Yeah. So that, I think, in my mind, is your argument, because then it gets into the specifics of, like, and this is how it's done.
Okay.
So the question's a little bit more open in the sense of, like, we you know the answer already, but you're kind of pretending like it could be anything. Like, who? What could it be? And then with the argument, you do, like, the reveal. It's this.
Okay, so, like, sure, that's fine. I mean, that's a fun little rhetorical moment. It's like anticipation and, like, satisfaction. Sure, like, that's fine. Okay.
It must be like how magicians feel. So how about you do, like, do you think, now, could that be done in 100 words?
Yeah, that must be quite concise, I think, to be effective anyway. I think that's kind of that's the thing of this whole thing, right?
Yeah. And then could the next 100 words be about, like, what various theory and lenses will you use to do this? Maybe combine that with the literature, because in a sense, I suppose when you bring up the theories, you are in a sense bringing up the literature at that point, right?
Yeah.
So maybe don't allow yourself 100 words, give yourself 200, maybe even 250.
Okay, so I think I'll probably start with like skin theory and trans theory, and then still don't bring in a defense, like, I still haven't clarified like gender related things though. I must clarify that, I think, before I start bringing in scholarship, because the scholarship needs to be filtered through the lens of gender, right? Yeah. Like when I'm looking at queer theory, it's basically intersecting with like the anal penetration masculinity studies, which like which is directed toward gender, right? So all of the, like, I have a whole kitchen sink of theories, but they're all like ways to interpret gender, and especially like skin and body. So that is very specific. So I want to be clear that I'm being specific.
Yep, I think that's a good idea. Maybe if you can't do it in 100 words, maybe like allow yourself 150, you know?
Okay, but I do, so where do I specify gender related stuff?
I think you have to put it in before you get into the literature. Right?
Yeah, so like it has to probably be in the question and the argument then.
Where you give the context and where you say, okay, and here's why I'm doing this, and, you know. So sometimes I'd say give the argument, and then if you need to, like, okay, now here, let me explain why this is. Let me give you a few reasons why, or let me give you some details as to why this is.
Okay.
You know, can that happen in, say, 3 or 4 sentences? I'd say try to think of it as, I'm only going to give you like the bare pitch. I'm not going to give you the real whole spiel, because there's not the time or space for it. But I'm just going to give you enough so that you feel like, okay, this is justified.
Yeah, and even like I'm trying to theorize like both like Gothic and like modern realism, but I have only really had like time to theorize Gothic, and honestly like what I've been telling you my argument is, bro, that is like taking enough time. And so I also, and with these assignments as well, like my entire second, probably not half but quarter, is supposed to be theorizing like realist decadent gender related things, which are basically Marxist consumerism and surfaces, and art, how people become art as opposed to how people become monsters if they're trans. So like, but I think anyway, so I guess my question would be, if I can somehow theorize all of that before I submit this assignment, is that like too much to somehow to pack in here? Like, I think probably
I think it's too much.
You do?
I think it's too much. Yeah, I think go with what you feel like you got a better grasp of right now. If you want to, towards the end of the proposal, you can hint at like, here's how I wish to expand it, or here's where it could be taken in other like future directions. But my take on it is just kind of pretend for now that you really just kind of kept the sort of focus of like one genre or like one era, you know. That would be my take on it, just to kind of make it simpler.
So I wonder if that's fine, because they have done that, maybe, but because they're, as kind of the tension between like, am I trying to do new research, because they've written like 2 books that I know of about trans Gothic studies, and so my twist on it is supposed to be trans decadent studies, which after reading a lot of stuff, basically my understanding of it is like the difference is like that you have to theorize trans Gothic and you have to theorize trans modern realism. So then like that would be kind of a little bit of twist to it, is theorizing like both and how they interact, and a lot of them are like opposites, so it's really interesting, right? Like you have a trans monster in the Gothic unconscious, which becomes like a trans piece of art in the Gothic consciousness. It is quite interesting. Like, I don't know, dude. So then I basically...
You can't theorize trans decadence by itself. You have to consider the trans modern, the trans Gothic.
Yes, but trans Gothic has already been done, and trans modern has already been done, kind of. So, like, I'm trying to, like, do both to make that interesting by, like juxtaposing or showing how they transition into each other.
Yeah, okay. Well, then if you need to explain that, just merely explain as to... This has been addressed, So you're saying in the Venn diagram, transmodern, is transdecadent like the overlap between those two, or you simply need to understand those two in order to understand transdecadent? So is there an overlap? Is transdecadent where they overlap and share some similarities, or is there no similarities between the transmodern and the transgothic?
They overlap. This is my working hypothesis. Who knows? But from my sense is that they overlap. My sense is they overlap.
So in a sense, you do need to cover that as well too.
Well, it would be nice, but I think if I don't do the Trans-Gothic, I don't have anything. But then it's also just a matter of like what I can have time to theorize in these assignments, right? It's been kind of hellish because I keep reading more and it's like, oh, I need to be writing, but like, so I think I've finally got a grasp on like the argument that I've been like telling you about. I think now like, and I'm gonna write this horrid review that has been haunting me for months that you know about, and like I have like 6 articles and like I can walk through and I can like show all this stuff. So again, maybe that's only like some of the work, but it might be that I have to emphasize it because it's like solid.
Well, let me put it this way, because you have to theorize the transmodern and transgothic, does that reflect in your literature? So when you look at like what you draw upon, does it then make sense as to like, yeah, this is why my literature is the way it is, because I have to kind of theorize both of the transmodern and transgothic, and hence why these are the kinds of theories and sources I'm drawing upon.
Yeah, in fact, I mean that's in a sense from the literature is how I decided I need to theorize both, because like they'll have trans monster, but they'll have like trans painting, and like they're the opposite thing. Like one is misshapen, one is beautiful, like, and then the painting becomes a monster, and like Dorian Gray. So it's like, yes, like they are kind of intersecting in actually quite interesting ways.
I would try to find ways then in which when you're going through the literature, then to give that insight in between. So, one of drawing upon this study because they're drawing on this theory for this reason.
Can you say that again in different words? I like heard all the words you just said, but somehow it didn't like click with my brain. Is that okay?
To try to incorporate some of that insight when you're doing a literature review. So
okay.
Not just use a literature review to here's a list of what I'm using, but here's what I'm using and here's why.
Yeah.
So you kind of like splice it in between. You kind of like, here's a theorem and that's here, and here's why, because I can't simply just look at the trans-decadent. The trans-decadent, is an overlap between the transmodern and trans-gothic, and hence why, we're using both. I'm using both of these theories or both of them.
Yeah, definitely. And it's good because it draws on pre-existing trans-gothic research, which is also still quite new and still pretty novel. So I think it's a nice place to put myself, where again, I'm like falling back a bit, right?
But it's interesting. I think it is this sort of intersection, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why it's been so hard to theorize, because there was just like disparate elements that I need to pull apart and theorize separately a little bit and then put back together. So yeah, I do think that's the case.
Interesting. Good. So how do you feel about that? Does that seem like, it may be a way of thinking of it is think of it as 500 words split into maybe like 150 words to kind of give the context, the topic, the question, the argument, and then like maybe 200, 250 words to kind of do the bulk of the literature review with some, sense of reflection or some insight as to why you were choosing these, why your research has led you down this particular path.
And now that somehow I think has to fold into, yeah, I mean, gender would fold in there, and then just like my defense of like, no, this is what I'm wondering too, like, how do I not seem defensive about the transiness or non-transiness of it? Because, like, I feel defensive about it because my supervisor is, like, very, like, adamant, oh, it needs to be this and that or the other, right? So now I have a write-up about, like, no, it doesn't need to be this or that or the other, but, like, how do I, like, incorporate that in a way that doesn't seem defensive but seems somehow inviting and, like, a positive thing, right?
Okay. Well, do you get the sense that you're having to combat with the instructor about like, I know I need to do this way, and they're trying to not get you to do that? Is that
yeah, like he wants like a nice, clean, wrong body narrative, basically, and I disagree, and I like have like the names of the trans, literally people who have transition genders, the trans theorists who are like, no, bro, we don't need we don't need a wrong body narrative. And it's not that way for everyone. That may be some type of trans experience, but not all trans experience. So I can literally counteract that. So I think that's very nice. But I don't want to just come out of the gate like swinging when like no one's fighting me. You know what I mean? Like I think I need to be sure or be careful about like how aggressive I seem trying to refute things that like maybe no one is accusing me of. I don't know. Do you know what I mean?
The invitation along the lines of like the non-normative path, as in that's, you know, in terms of it, you can see it as sort of like the positive, and the invitation is it's not like telling you what we don't need, but what we do need is non-normative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
so
using trans theory for that. Okay, yes. So do you think I mentioned the wrong body narrative and how this is not constitutive of transness necessarily? It may be important. I mean, anyone who is reading it who is a trans theorist or even a gender theorist may be interested to know, right? I mean, my supervisor, if nothing else, is pretty fastidious and like bringing up criticisms he thinks other people are going to bring up to me, right? So if to him it's very important, it may be actually an important theoretical like point at issue, you know?
Can I ask, do you see the non-normative as replacing the wrong body narrative, or in a way does it enhance it? Are we looking at competition between these two, or can we look at collaboration between these two?
I think it's more collaborative.
Can we frame it as a collaborative? So as opposed to sort of like a mutually exclusive, it's either this or this, can it be mutually inclusive? It can be both wrong body narrative, but with the intention of generating a kind of a non-normative stance. I'm wondering, or do we say like a sort of natural evolution of, you know, the wrong body narrative into the ideal, which is going to be a non-normative?
I think it's more like a positionality towards non-normative gender in order to enact desires. Like, the body is not as important as, like, these people are kind of, like, using their skin and their body to, like, resituate their, like, ideologies about gender and how they, like, fit into the world. And, like, it's cool. Like, one of the novels, like, a female body character, when they, like, embody this masculine, like, energy and they cross-dress, then they're, like, you know, driving, it's, like, late 1800s, like, driving a cart, like, really fast, like, through the countryside, and then they, like, want to do this, like, historical reenactment, but usually they're, like, fading out of existence, like, ghostly. So, like, this gender non-normativity or like transness like enables them to like move through the world and like interact with objects in like a way that is more expressive. Like it adds something good to their life, right? So it's like very functional. So it's not, the label of the body is not like necessarily important at all. There's no fixation on that, I don't think. There's a fixation on like doing what you want to do and being free from gender norms.
Yes, I was going to say, do you see it as more of a freedom, whereas the wrong body narrative, does that sometimes come with a sense of never achieving that freedom, or it could be a sense of like frustration? I just wonder if what you're seeing is kind of like a movement beyond that frustration to, it doesn't necessarily need to be about the wrong body.
Well, and the wrong body focus, like, I think comes about more through social transitioning at this time. So like people would literally just wear clothes of like the other sex and like pass themselves off as the other sex. So my characters like are not very interested in that. Like it is truly there. It's not about transitioning genders in the sense that if they have a female body, they want to be treated like a male all the time, and they just want to have the same name but the masculine form. It's more just like they're sliding in and out of gender categories and they're trying to like interact with the world. Like it's quite interesting. But so I don't know if I've totally theorized like it's more like I think it's like the Deleuzian like positioning towards transness or positioning towards non-normativity, which unfortunately are kind of the same thing. Like I feel like the labels are not very good. Like so then you can bring in other labels like this trans theorist like Andrea Long Chu, her idea is like everyone is female and everyone hates it. So female is like a third class of gender as opposed to woman and man, where female is anyone who other desires are acted upon them. And of course that's everyone, but people try not to see themselves that way, especially in masculinity studies, right? The unpenetrable male, right? Mm-hmm. So
by exploring and using the non-binary narratives, the non-normative, if we take a step back, what we can see is there's a lot of labeling going on, and not all of it is actually helpful.
And not to analyzing. Like, I think the labels are really getting in the way of analyzing these texts. Like, I think we just look at the methods used in the text and then impute something about, yes, the labels are not very helpful. Which is, I mean, that's like sorry, I just want to say too, that's like the meta argument of like literally this time period. Because the argument that everyone makes in every single chapter about sexology in the late 1800s is literally gender was sliced and spliced in this bizarre way that has kind of fucked everyone over for the last like 100 years. So like, that is very like the argument of the period too that we make now about it, that this was a problem, right? The way gender was like packaged and sold to people. So it's also very that argument, in fact, of the decadent period, of the fin de siècle, of the 1800s.
So in a sense, I wonder if your point was that let's maybe not focus on the labels, let's focus on this.
Which, which many scholars have proven, especially Foucault, right, has proven the labels are not great.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, that means you probably still have to use the labels as a way to then explain why those labels are, in a sense, something to kind of be sort of handled, I think, in a certain way. In other words, it's sometimes like you have to like know something well, then to know when not to use it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's nice too, because like transness assumes transgendered person, and masculinity and femininity studies assume cisgender. So if you use all three lenses, you can cover the range, right, of what's going on. But so if we were assuming from one side, based on the lenses, what the lenses are able to see, you could never see the full picture, you know?
Yes.
Because there's elements of transness, and there's elements of, like, non-normativity, and I think both are important in these specific texts.
Transcend these labels?
What's that?
At some point, do you have to transcend these labels?
I mean, that's, like, literally what they're trying to do, so I would assume so.
Yeah. But you do need to know these labels at first. In other words, it's not like, well, if we're going to transcend them, let's just leave it. No, you have to, I think, in a sense, understand these labels, understand how they're being used with the intent of, you know, moving beyond them.
And they were also and that's in fact what the characters do, because they were also the discursive limits placed on the characters that the characters themselves are attempting to move through, right? And in fact, the authors are actually showing the characters doing that. And there's also a weird double lens where, like, the characters are actually artists, and they're actually creating a narrative that, like, is a gender non-normative narrative. So it's actually really cool.
And then you as a researcher are also seeing, like, yes, moving beyond those labels is, so that's interesting. That's an interesting kind of, like I said, there's like a meta level to it.
And that's very, like, trans-decadent, because decadence was this period of, like, the chaos of, like, what the fuck are these labels? Like, it is that moment of that, which is why, and then you also get the Gothic, and then the modern subject comes out of that. So it was a cool time, actually, to theorize.
But you do have to kind of sort of do this big capture. It's almost like you have to get your arms out and make, okay, I need to capture all of this, and then for the purpose of seeing, like, you know, so that we can then ask these questions. Like, what is this?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it does involve that sort of, like, big catch-all first. Kind of trying to grasp it all, I guess, in a sense, with the idea of maybe kind of letting some things go, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you may or may not be able to kind of get that whole concept by in its complexity. So my take on it is, if you can't, just don't. Just refrain from it. Just go, pump the brakes, bring it back, and go, okay, I'm only going to go this far.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes you just simply can't do this in this few word count, you know?
And for a PhD, like, I think it's hard too, because, like, obviously I'm not a PhD student, and it is kind of, like, overwhelming, the sense of writing something for a PhD application, right? Like, some imposter syndrome, maybe. But so this is not the moment to overcomplicate to show that I'm smart, right? Like, if there's anything I've learned from graduate school, it's like, you don't do that, right?
Yeah, at a certain point, you do that, you're going to run out of energy, you're going to run out of steam. You'd be better off just going, you know what? This is not the final word on whatever it is anyway, even though it's a complex process, and you can see how people are sort of not doing, you can see how people are limiting things, but it's like, do I need to do all this? Do I need to be the one that kind of captures this all in one go? Maybe not. Maybe you can simply step into the discussion and play out your role in that discussion without having to kind of take on I think the role of clarifying and sorting it out for everybody.
So in that case, I think it might be important to nod to the fact that I also am interested in the modern realist elements without necessarily like trying to break it down in the proposal. Because again, if I don't even nod to it, then I basically am not doing new research. But I don't think both can fit, and I haven't theorized it. So I don't know. Like, how would you, or is that worse?
I think you have a sense of like, this is what it could do, and then this is probably getting a bit too much.
So really just argue trans Gothic, even though that's already been done, and just be good with that?
As long as you explain why then connects with the trans decadent. Is that possible? So what I don't want to see is then suddenly you're talking about the trans Gothic with no sense of, oh, hang on, why are we even talking about it? As long as you kind of give sense of why this is happening or why you are mentioning that, I think the reader can follow along. My concern is don't just throw the terms in there assuming that the reader is going to understand the connection. You have to do the connecting part for them. Even if you can do it concisely, that's good. And if you can't make the connection concisely, that's where I go to, well, then can we simplify it? Can we simply just tell them less information so that they don't get an idea in their heads that they then can't understand why you're saying this?
Okay, but it sounds like, in a sense, maybe I need to theorize enough to summarize something logical about it, because I probably can't actually leave it out if I want to be doing the project I've been, like, telling people I'm doing, you know?
Yeah. Let's go with the some but not all information. So I'm going to tell you some things but not all things.
And I mean, honestly, that's going to be whatever I can actually get done anyway, so I'll theorize from the most to least important, and I guess whatever I come up with, okay, that makes sense. And I know it's been, like,
okay?
over time, too, so thank you so much. Yeah, this is so great. I always love brainstorming with you. It helps so much.
Well, that's great, Jen. Yeah, you're right. We'll have to wrap up, but if that kind of got you on your way for today, then we'll let you go, and maybe we'll get a chance to catch up in the new year.
Mm-hmm. It's sounding better, at least, right? Like, you've been talking to me for a while. Like, is this at least sounding like something now?
It's pretty common with our graduate students that is usually like when we're dealing with this kind of level of research, I can't get all in one session. It's like we have to kind of build on it and kind of get like more and more insight. And in the process, we do, I think, often come to kind of the idea of, all right, here's definitely something that you want to focus on. Some things you kind of leave behind. It's kind of like, think of like, as you're going on a journey, sometimes you go, you know what, I don't need this anymore. I can get by without this, right? So you do you evolve, I think. I think that's pretty common. That's pretty natural.
Okay, but so it's looking, like, just from your, like, even your personal opinion, is this sounding like better research than when I started seeing you, at least?
Yeah, I think it's still very interesting, and I still kind of, as I get more and more refined, I think, yeah, that's good. It's okay for it to get more specific. It's okay for it to kind of get, or in some cases, to show me something that I haven't realized yet. But I think you're on the right track.
Okay. Thank you so much.